Hi there! Welcome back to another video on my channel. I'm here, I am back. We missed Writers Wednesday last week, but I'm hoping to move forward now. If you didn't watch my last makeup video I posted literally yesterday, I broke my microphone, it fell off my desk, and it died. So I had to order a new one, and that is why there were no uploads last week. But we're here now, and let me know if you like the audio quality with the new microphone. And I'm here to do another Writers Wednesdays for you guys. Yes, I've returned with my very floppy, natural blonde, rooty hair. To bring you guys a new video for Writers Wednesdays. So enough of me mumbling. What are we doing? We are talking about how to classify your work, your story, your book into a very specific genre. If you're interested in that, just keep on watching. Okay, so let's start off with what is the point of classifying your book into a specific genre? A lot of writers have problems with doing this. I had problems with narrowing down what exactly I wanted to label my first book as well. And this is common. And a lot of people like to say, well, I don't like labels, you know what I mean? But unfortunately for us, the industry does. Labels are important if you are learning how to categorize things and how to market things and how to sell things to other people. So hence, this is why finding out what genre you want to label your book as is very important, even before you start selling, when you're like going to try to pitch your ideas to different publishers. So for this, I'm mainly going to be talking about classifications within the realm of fiction, but I can go through and give you guys a brief description of other book categories outside of fiction real quick. And I'm going to throw up like different diagrams and stuff that might kind of help you. It can be very, very confusing, more confusing than it should be, frankly. This is kind of like, let's like just kind of start general and then get more specific. That's kind of how I'm going to structure this video. So anyway, the 5 genres of just like writing in general, I guess, would be drama, which is more about like plays and playbills, things like that. You have works of poetry, and there are subgenres within all of these categories too, but there's poetry as well. There are folktales, which a lot of people still write into contemporary novels. The difference with folktales is that they are stories that have been passed down orally within a given culture and become like, sometimes they even become like become a moral framework. Like, you know, you have folktales that try to teach kids what to do, what not to do, what to look out for. Folktales can also be intrinsic into our belief systems and our religions as well, or they can muddy the two sometimes. So, I mean, folktales are like fairy tales, things like that. Then, obviously, past that, you have fiction and nonfiction. As I mentioned earlier, fiction kind of borrows from folktales sometimes. That is like a subgenre of fiction in and of itself. But you have fiction and nonfiction, which is the main difference between those two, is if it is grounded in any real factual storytelling. So obviously nonfiction would be things, writing about things that have happened, or writing about things that it's a theory that's like supported by data and evidence, or, you know, just like more about biographies, narrative pieces like that. So like in nonfiction, you pretty much have 2 subgenres, which is like perspective versus narrative. I was kind of getting ahead of myself there for a moment. But yeah, you have perspective versus narrative. And the difference is perspective is something that can be taught. Like it could be educational, it can be an observation. Like writing books on health or health advice can be something perspective because you're teaching your audience something new. And narrative is more intrinsically literally what it means. A narrative, it is a retelling, an interesting retelling of something that happened. So say you want to basically just describe the Battle of Waterloo and make it more exciting, but you don't change any of the actual, I mean, you don't necessarily change the entire story. Like all of a sudden Napoleon doesn't become an alien. You know what I mean? So yes, so that's nonfiction. If you're interested in that, there is a big market for nonfiction, especially like self-help books, which do fairly well. So the main books within nonfiction tend to be business, self-help, relationship advice, personal development, and memoirs. Shout out today, Elvira, the mistress of the night, mistress of the dark, wrote in her memoirs that she has been in a relationship with a woman for the past 19 years. So she has come out today. So that is another perfect example of memoirs for nonfiction. We stand. Welcome to the LGBTQ community, Miss Elvira. Yes, kicking off spooky season right. I just had to throw that out there. I was going to mention this in the video somehow, and I found a perfect segue. But yeah, anyway, that is an example of a memoir, and one that would be super interesting to read. So now we're going to go into fiction. Fiction, I feel like, is very popular for a lot of authors. The other genres have their merits, don't get me wrong, but I think when people think about authors, they think about people who have written long works of fiction. Not saying that poetry can't be, awesome, because of course you have people like Sylvia Plath, very famous poets, but poetry books can be a very hard sell if you want to be traditionally published. They prove to be more difficult than necessarily fiction or nonfiction. So that's just something to be mindful of. Of course, you can always take poetic elements and use them as a writing style in your fiction, which plenty of people have done before. But yeah, it's just something for you to know. I'm going to be talking about fiction mostly because that's what I released, and that is really popular within the writing business. Fiction can be broken down into a lot of different genres, right? But some of the main ones, or the ones that I've seen do the best in terms of like conventional sales, or that are like most popular right now, tend to be like romance and erotica, first and foremost. I don't know if it was the pandemic or what, but romance sales skyrocketed recently. I know so many people who write romance, and that's great for them. It's not necessarily my cup of tea, but as a genre on its own, it's a very, very powerful genre, and people love it. So you have to put romance first. There's also this genre called like women's fiction. And again, that's one of those genres for myself that I have a hard time really identifying. I don't know. Editing Cassidy is going to do a little bit more research on this and throw a definition on screen right now. Because again, this seems like a very gendered fiction to me, and this is something that I try not to do. This probably relates to works that deal with directly like women's issues, kind of like The Handmaid's Tale, and things like that, I guess would be classified as women's fiction. But just so I don't catch myself, I'm going to put up some definition on here while I go back and edit, and then you and I will both learn what exactly that means. I don't want to sound unprofessional. It's just in my head, I think gendered literary works have their place in terms of creating a safe space for people, but I do think it's dangerous, in my opinion, or not dangerous, but it can be exclusatory to still label things in terms of gender binary, if that makes sense. Again, in my opinion, I think women's issues need to be progressed, but we need to also remember that women's issues don't just affect women. They affect non-binary folks, trans folk, all sorts of people. So that's just my 2 cents, throwing it out there. You may disagree with me on that. That's totally fine. I might get a weird comment about that. But anyway, I digress. There's also a lot of weight in historical fiction and mystery right now. Mystery as a genre is very, very popular. I myself am reading some mystery books right now, and I'm really interested in mystery because I think the next 2 stories after the Cursed Fate series, I'm going to focus on mysteries. I'm really excited to try and do that. I've been really inspired by a lot of mysteries. So I'm trying to read more to understand that genre a little bit better, and then hopefully I can learn some things when I try to write it for myself. But yeah, historical fiction has always been a thing. I think people like to romanticize different eras, and of course, like during a global pandemic, like a global pandemic, one tends to turn nostalgic, or at least turns to some form of escapism, even if that's a retroactive, like back in time form of escapism. You also have crime and thrillers being very, very popular. Like, oh my God, I cannot tell you this. I'm also guilty of this too, right? I love true crime and like mysteries and murder mysteries. My husband thinks I'm absolutely bonkers for this, but I would listen to true crime podcasts and like those makeup and murder videos. I know Bailey Sarian does those, and I'm watching somebody else who's kind of has a very similar vibe in what she does for her YouTube videos, but oh my God, I don't like to see it. Like, I don't like to see graphic pictures or anything like that. Like, that bothers me. But like the storytelling and like, I don't know, just like the thrill of it, and I want to catch the bad guy, I guess. That's like what motivates me to really getting into true crime. I don't know. I think that's a very women, like, again, I don't want to go into the gender binary, but I noticed that like a lot of people who gravitate towards crime and think I've noticed that a lot of people who gravitate toward true crime tend to be people with more inherent feminine energy. Yeah, I don't know, but I love that true crime stuff, so I don't know. I'm part of that too. And then lastly, we have both science fiction and fantasy. Some publishers and some people lump these two together, although in my personal opinion, I feel like they're very distinct and very separate things. I enjoy both. But I feel like science fiction has its own rules to operate under, and fantasy also has a separate set of rules. Some publishers throw them together. I feel like a lot of publishers, if they do one, they do the other. But for me, because this is what I'm also interested in, that's kind of the umbrella I'm operating under. So let's just talk, for example, a little bit further about science fiction and fantasy, because again, that's what I can speak on personally. Of course, if requested, I will dive deeper and do each subgenre and talk about the multi-layers of things that could be in each one. I was thinking about doing a video just dedicated to like dark fantasy, which is what I'm writing in currently, and what I get a lot of inspiration from, and what goes into that. But we can talk. Yeah, let's just talk generally. So. Yeah, science fiction and fantasy. So science fiction is basically just any fiction that has to relate to science. Boom. So this could be a lot of different materials. The science could be made up, or it could be grounded in fact. When I was first writing Cursed Fate, I wanted it to be far more of a science fiction, and then it just kind of leapt to the magical fantasy side of things. I think you can see that in my early writing, because I try my best to explain like how this is physically possible, and I get a little kind of bogged down in details, which is okay. I know that now as an author, and I'm learning and growing, and I think it's important to critique yourself as an author too, to like once you publish something, if you're continuing to publish, to be like, okay, I learned from this experience, and now I'm going to move on and try this instead, or this works, so I'm going to keep using it, yada yada yada. But yeah, so science fiction, any sort of fiction with science. I think the most popular or most well-known version of science fiction is probably space operas, which is exactly what Star Wars is. It is a space opera. I think Star Trek also falls into that category, of being a space opera. But there are other things that are very science fiction-y that don't fall under that. You also have like cyberpunk, steampunk, monster making. I'm going to throw a diagram up here that I really got a lot of help from. I found this on someone's website. I think her name was Jane Elderman, but I kind of stole this from her website. Oops. And it goes into a beautiful breakdown of different fiction genres and like subgenres within that, so you can pause the video, take a quick glance at it if you'd like. Likewise, if we talk about fantasy's more about like magic, and fantasy can also, what I was mentioning earlier, borrow from like long-standing beliefs that already exist. So folktales, reimagined fairy tales, retelling of fairy tales, I know that's super popular, or like princesses and stuff like that. Basically what Disney did for how many decades. But also, when you hear fantasy, you think of like probably high fantasy, right? That's what it's called. So high fantasy is like Lord of the Rings, where those books just go on and on and on and on. You get lots of descriptions, lots of words, really immense lore building and world building going on. Probably like people who enjoy Dungeons and Dragons, that type of narrative. But you also have different types of fantasy as well outside of that. That doesn't necessarily have to be high fantasy. I don't write in high fantasy. I really admire the people who do that and who stick to their little world. I just know for myself that it's not for me, because I'm the kind of person that has like hundreds of ideas at once, and I want to work on all of them all the time. So it's hard for me to like really close the blinds off and be like, this is it. This is all I'm going to do. This is my world, and I'm just going to keep reenacting different versions of this world. Again, that Tolkien did this. Despite what you feel about him, H.P. Lovecraft kind of did this, although I would not necessarily categorize his stuff as high fantasy, because his descriptions are more like, instead of being very precise and well worded, a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stuff is just kind of like, oh, it's so terrifying, you wouldn't even believe it, and then leaves it at that. Anyway, so you have high fantasy, but you also have things like contemporary fantasy. So that's fantasy that takes place in modern settings. That is a genre I tend to enjoy as well. I guess contemporary is also like urban fantasy too, where it's like fantasy taking place within city limits or a city environment. The first thing that literally popped into my head about this, I don't know if you've seen that, there's like a vampire movie on Netflix that takes place in New York. And it's basically just like a metaphor for gentrification. I really enjoyed it, but if I remember the name of the movie, I'll put it in there, but I'm sure you guys have seen it. If not, check it out. It's a good for Halloween type of movie. But yeah, so that's kind of like an idea of like an urban fantasy, right? That is also something that I was like initially labeling Cursed Fate as, because it takes place in here and now. The protagonist, Vincent, is very much a modern protagonist, or somebody from this current generation, but that wasn't necessarily right either. So again, your book can have elements from different genres and subgenres in it. I think a good example of this is like the fact that most storylines have some sort of like romantic subplot going on. I don't know why. Admittingly, people have pressured me to put a romantic subplot into Cursed Fate, and I've been considering it, but it might not be what you expect. We'll see. I don't know. I don't like romance, period. So that's probably something that won't be in any of my stories, but you know, you watch like Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I know I'm not referencing straight up books. I'm sorry, this is just whatever comes to mind. But Avatar: The Last Airbender had tons of like romantic subplots within the story, and they're fun. People like project themselves onto characters. It's just for a fun time. Speaking of which, I totally forgot this. I don't know, but like an up and coming genre of fiction that I find fascinating is like fan fiction. And here's the thing, fan fiction has existed forever. Don't let anyone tell you differently. And I'm going to say a really hot take that's going to piss off a lot of literary people, especially with English literature, but half of English literature literally is fan fiction. Literally there was this period in English literature where Anglo people, right, were borrowing a lot of stories from the Greeks, or appropriating Greek characters and rewriting them for an English audience, right? This still goes on today. Like Lore Olympus in my head is like a fan fiction, but it's a fun story. Don't get me wrong. It's so popular. It's great. This is the exact thing our ancestors were doing so long ago. And it blows my mind that a lot of people who study English literature don't view it this way. And they view it like as a concrete work of art. It's fanfic. Twilight was originally a fanfic. You know, there are fanfics of a fanfic, and it keeps going on. And I love this idea because it's like, for me, this really fits in with like my senior thesis and what I studied. So like, if you go, again, another video on my channel, I studied the concept of memes in public diplomacy and how memes affect politics, essentially. And this is, in my head, fanfics are just an embodiment of memes, but in like a literary perspective. Maybe I should do a video on it. This would be so much fun. Okay, this is a new video idea. I won't get too much. I just am totally rambling in front of the camera. Sorry. But like, think about it, because you don't have to be a well-renowned established author to write a fanfic. And in fact, a lot of fanfics online are read like under the covers, and they form their own specific subgroups of fans. Like, I was on Webtoon. I used to be on Webtoon all the time, and I loved Webtoon. And if you don't have that app, you should get it. It's basically just comics written by everyday people and published on this site. I haven't read it in a while, though. But there's this weird like Webtoon that I was obsessed with, which was like Scooby-Doo as like an anti-hero, and it was poorly drawn, but it had every cartoon character you can imagine, and it had this like really like dark storyline that was like space opera, but also just like genocide was happening, and like an interstellar war between all these cartoon characters, and it was nuts. But I don't know, like, but the fact that I was in this very niche fan group that was a weird ass fanfic of Hanna-Barbera cartoons, like, you know what I mean? So it obviously doesn't have to be that extreme, but fanfics have become very main staples. They're driven by a very young audience most of the time. Or if they're not, they're like propagated by young audiences, and they hold a lot of clout. Like, I see Lauren Lippis stuff in Hot Topic, and I'm so proud for the person who created that. But I do think fanfics are something to like watch out for, because they've always been popular. It's just been taboo to talk about, and I feel like that taboo is breaking now, which I'm here for, because I used to be that kind of person that like, I was very judgmental towards people who read fanfics and who wrote fanfics, but or like the shipping with the reader or whatever. But like, I don't know what it is. I think it's a product of the popularity is resurging again, because there's a lack of taboo, because nobody cares anymore. Like, the world is ending. What do we have to be ashamed of, right? As long as it's not criminal, you're good. And also, it's this idea of like, I was watching a lot of videos on like parasocial relationships too, and I feel like that social media and celebrity culture is like intrinsic into creating parasocial relationships, especially with young people projecting onto things that they enjoy. So ergo, fanfics are born. You have like people who love BTS who read BTS X reader stuff. Back in my day, when I was young and in preteen, I would read stuff people would put online about like the Reader and the Weasley twins, because that was my cup of tea. That's what I did back then. You know, we're airing dirty laundry, but it's the truth, right? So fanfics, again, long-winded thing. Fanfic, I'm not really sure where to put it, because fanfics themselves can cross different genres, as just what I talked about right now. Maybe it should be its own thing. Debate in the comments with me to talk about fanfics and like how we view this. But anyway, back on track to fantasy, science fiction, everything like that. So let me just kind of wrap up this video of just this long rant. I don't know if you're actually going to find this to be helpful, but this could be the first introduction to a series of things like this. So we're going to talk about how I came to classify my book Cursed Fate as a dark fantasy. I've also used the tags as young adult. It doesn't necessarily have to be young adult. I've learned that my audience is very varied in age. I have a fan who's like in their 90s, and then I have fans who are in 12. Which I think is fine. Young adult tends to get a bad rep, even though young adult books are some of the most popular books of all time. They get a bad rep in the industry, so people, and I learned this the hard way, people are less likely to pick up your book if you use the phrase young adult, even though it is something that is like very apparent on the website. There's some stigma against it. I don't know. So I was using young adult for a while. I don't think that's necessarily accurate anymore, because also I just don't know what's appropriate for young adult. There's no sex scenes on my book or anything like that, but my gauge of like appropriateness for teenagers is very skewed. There's a lot of cuss words. I was using swear words when I was a teenager, and I was engaged in those activities when I was a teenager. And I just don't know how to gauge what's appropriate or inappropriate in general. So I'm sorry. But, so yeah, could you also do young adult that way? But ultimately, I ended up settling on dark fantasy, and I'll tell you why. I started doing more research specifically on the category of dark fantasy, and although the thematics of my book aren't the same as this, I'm going to just use Lovecraft because I think that's the most common example. Even though my books didn't necessarily have the same themes going on, it had the same mechanics. So like in my book, I'm not going to try to give away the ending or anything like that, but a staple of dark fantasy is that there are some scary elements included. There are some elements of horror meant to scare the reader. There's quite a few scenes in my book that are very scary. Again, I don't know what's appropriate or not. I think my threshold for horror is different than everybody else's, but even if it's not like blood and guts and stuff, there are some scenes that are very emotional or very emotionally scarring. Dark fantasy also tends to play on the feelings, the emotion of the characters, and to heighten the sense of the reader. It also does a lot of descriptive things describing the environment, which is also how I tend to write. I am more of a descriptive writer. Dialogue is hard for me. We've established that on this channel. In addition to that, one of the staples of dark fantasy is that there tends to not be a happy ending at the end. Or, you know, if it, like Lovecraft, the whole point of his books is that you know that the main character is going to die at the end, and it's just watching them descend into madness. And I still don't know how I'm going to end this sequel, you know, but if it fits the genre, it fits the genre. It might have not a purposely like, oh, everyone's fucked kind of ending, but it might, the way it's feeling like in my heart, it might be something that not everyone is like satisfied with. We'll see. I don't know. And so because of the mechanics, that's why I label my book as a dark fantasy. Is it urban? Is there a modern protagonist? You betcha. Is there magic involved, and animal magic, and a lot of whimsy? Oh yeah, definitely fantasy. Is there some folk elements brought in? Yeah. Something that I want to talk about is that, like, again, just my opinion, there's a difference between, like, drawing inspiration from the area that it's set in and then writing about things you don't know. So a lot of the time, I wrote the book inspired by some plants and animals from Madagascar, because in my head, I was like, oh, this would be an interesting area. I haven't really seen this take before. I'm not from there. I've never lived there. And so I try hard not to put any serious religious taboos or talk too much about religion in the book, because that is something I do not understand. From what I understand, it is a pretty Christian country, but they do have their own history and folk history. I borrowed ideas of like, oh, this is what the houses used to look like. So I described houses. I described animals. I described things that have grown there that are part of nature. Or I've taken a lot of inspiration from landscapes from Madagascar and put it into my new world that I was building. So, you know, lemurs, like, they're from Madagascar. So there's a lot of lemurs in my new world, my fictional world that I built up. I got inspiration from the Singi, like the actual Singi, like the national park. I made an island in my new world that used a lot of those rock formations as well. But it's important to understand that, like, me not being from there, I can't rewrite their folk traditions because I do not understand them, and I would only be doing a disservice to that place, right? So we're towing a line. I think authors should be able to write about things that inspire them? Oh, yes. Definitely. I know that, even there's like Western anime studios now with like Westerners making their own version of anime, in a similar style, but like through Westernized storytelling and writing. I think inevitably cultures intermix and stuff like that, but, I just think also too it's like important not to like tell stories that don't necessarily belong to you, because some practices are closed, some stories are sacred to these people, and they've already had to deal with so much of their history being erased that I just don't think we should contribute to that by appropriating their stuff and stealing it and making it what we want it to be. There's plenty of other authors too that I should mention, and I might put a list in the description below who write kind of like folky, magic-y fantasy stories, but they are people of that culture, or they at least are somebody of that background. And especially like we're seeing this now with the insurgence of like Black fantasy authors, and they do a lot of fantasy books based on like African culture. And if you're interested in that, I highly recommend reading them. So again, another rant. Sorry, I have so many rants in this video. But to really end it off, my biggest advice, I think, is to basically just list out books that are similar to yours, or have similar elements, or like, similar mechanics like I did, to really figure out like, okay, this is what my genre is. Because you're going to need to do this if you're pitching to a traditional publisher. Even if you're self-publishing, like listing it online, it just helps to be able to know what tags to use for like social media algorithms, and search engine optimization stuff. So no matter what, if you're trying to sell it through any other means besides your own, they're going to have you label it. So just look for stories that are similar to yours. If you're writing a piece that takes place like back in the 20s during Prohibition era, and it's about people that would have lived through the time and faces a lot of emphasis on that time period, it's probably a historical fiction, right? If there's a romance in it, it's a historical fiction, a historical romance. If you're somebody who is writing a giant op piece about, people colonizing Mars and living in space, and there is some sort of ultimate battle over territory and resources between two warring planets, that sounds like a space opera. That sounds like a space odyssey, right? So, and that is probably similar to like Avatar and what went on Pandora and stuff like that. So just identify your plot, your themes, your mechanics, whatever. Look at what's similar to yours, who employs similar writing styles, whatever, and just put it in accordingly. I know we all want to think that like we're super unique and what we're doing has never been done before, and there probably is elements of your story that is really unique and eye-catching, but we're human beings. We all share the same sort of brain, or at least the evolved version of a brain. And I promise you there is something that is similar in some regards to your book. So that should help you out. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. If you want to hear more from me, I do these sort of Writer Wednesdays every week on Wednesday. And feel free to engage with me in the comments, share this with a friend. Any sort of engagement really helps my channel. I really appreciate it. And until next time, thanks. Bye.